Chapter 3 of Book 14 of Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabella Florence Hapgood. Book 14, The Grandeurs of Despair, Chapter 3. Gavroche would have done better to accept Enjolras' carbine. They threw a long black shawl of widow Hucheloops over Father Mabeuf. 6 men made a litter of their guns. On this they laid the body and bore it with bared heads, with solemn slowness, to the large table in the tap-room. These men, wholly absorbed in the grave and sacred task in which they were engaged, thought no more of the perilous situation in which they stood. When the corpse passed near Javert, who was still impassive, Enjolras said to the spy, "It will be your turn presently." During all this time, little Gavroche, who alone had not quitted his post, but had remained on guard, though he thought he espied some men stealthily approaching the barricade. All at once he shouted, "Look out!" Courfeyrac, Enjolras, Jean Prouvaire, Combeferre, Joly, Barrol, Bossuet, and all the rest ran tumultuously from the wine-shop. It was almost too late. They saw a glistening density of bayonets undulating above the barricade. Municipal guards of lofty stature were making their way in, some striding over the omnibus, others through the cut, thrusting before them the urchin who retreated but did not flee. The moment was critical. It was that first redoubtable moment of inundation, when the stream rises to the level of the levee, and when the water begins to filter through the fissures of a dike. A second more and the barricade would have been taken. Bahorel dashed upon the first municipal guard who was entering and killed him on the spot with a blow from his gun. The second killed Bahorel with a blow from his bayonet, and another had already overtaken Courfeyrac, who was shouting, "Follow me!" The largest of all, a sort of colossus, marched on Gavroche with his bayonet fixed. The urchin took in his arms Javert's immense gun, levelled it resolutely at the giant, and fired. No discharge followed. Javert's gun was not loaded. The municipal guard burst into a laugh and raised his bayonet at the child. Before the bayonet had touched Gavroche, the gun slipped from the soldier's grasp. A bullet had struck the municipal guardsman in the center of the forehead, and he fell over on his back. A second bullet struck the other guard, who had assaulted Courfeyrac, in the breast, and laid him low on the pavement. This was the work of Marius, who had just entered the barricade. Chapter 4. The Barrel of Powder. Marius, still concealed in the turn of the Rue Mondétour, had witnessed, shuddering and irresolute, the first phase of the combat, but he had not long been able to resist that mysterious and sovereign vertigo which may be designated as the call of the abyss. In the presence of the imminence of the peril, in the presence of the death of Monsieur Mabeuf, that melancholy enigma, in the presence of Barrol killed, and Courfeyrac shouting, "Follow me!" of that child threatened, of his friends to succor or to avenge, all hesitation had vanished, and he flung himself into the conflict, his 2 pistols in hand. With his first shot he had saved Gavroche, and with the second delivered Courfeyrac. Amid the sound of the shots, amid the cries of the assaulted guards, the assailants had climbed the entrenchment, on whose summit municipal guards, soldiers of the line, and national guards from the suburbs could now be seen, gun in hand, rearing themselves to more than half the height of their bodies. They already covered more than 2/3 of the barrier, but they did not leap into the enclosure, as though wavering in the fear of some trap. They gazed into the dark barricade as one would gaze into a lion's den. The light of the torch illuminated only their bayonets, their bearskin caps, and the upper part of their uneasy and angry faces. Marius had no longer any weapons. He had flung away his discharged pistols after firing them, but he had caught sight of the barrel of powder in the tap-room near the door. As he turned half round, gazing in that direction, a soldier took aim at him. At the moment when the soldier was sighting Marius, a hand was laid on the muzzle of the gun and obstructed it. This was done by someone who had darted forward, the young workman in velvet trousers. The shot sped, traversed the hand, and possibly also the workman, since he fell, but the ball did not strike Marius. All this, which was rather to be apprehended than seen through the smoke, Marius, who was entering the tap-room, hardly noticed. Still he had, in a confused way, perceived that gun-barrel aimed at him, and the hand which had blocked it, and he had heard the discharge. But in moments like this, The things which one sees vacillate and are precipitated, and one pauses for nothing. One feels obscurely impelled towards more darkness still, and all is cloud. The insurgents, surprised but not terrified, had rallied. Enjolras had shouted, "Wait! Don't fire at random!" In the first confusion they might in fact wound each other. The majority of them had ascended to the window on the first story and to the attic windows, whence they commanded the assailants. The most determined, with Enjolras, Courfeyrac, and Jean Prouvaire and Combeferre, had proudly placed themselves with their backs against the houses at the rear, unsheltered and facing the ranks of soldiers and guards who crowned the barricade. All this was accomplished without haste, with that strange and threatening gravity which precedes engagements. They took aim, point blank, on both sides. They were so close that they could talk together without raising their voices. When they had reached this point, where the spark is on the brink of darting forth, an officer in a gorget extended his sword and said, "Lay down your arms!" "Fire!" replied Enjolras. The two discharges took place at the same moment, and all disappeared in smoke. An acrid and stifling smoke, in which dying and wounded lay with weak, dull groans. When the smoke cleared away, the combatants on both sides could be seen to be thinned out, but still in the same positions, reloading in silence. All at once a thundering voice was heard, shouting, "Be off with you, or I'll blow up the barricade!" All turned in the direction whence the voice proceeded. Marius had entered the tap-room, and had seized the barrel of powder. Then he had taken advantage of the smoke, and the sort of obscure mist which filled the entrenched enclosure, to glide along the barricade as far as that cage of paving stones where the torch was fixed, to tear it from the torch, to replace it by the barrel of powder, to thrust the pile of stones under the barrel, which was instantly staved in, with a sort of horrible obedience. All this had cost Marius but the time necessary to stoop and rise again, and now all, National Guards, municipal guards, officers, soldiers, huddled at the other extremity of the barricade, gazed stupidly at him as he stood with his foot on the stones, his torch in his hand, his haughty face illuminated by a fatal resolution, drooping the flame of the torch towards the redoubtable pile, where they could make out the broken barrel of powder, and giving vent to that startling cry, "Be off with you, or I'll blow up the barricade!" Marius on that barricade after the octogenarian was the vision of the young revolution after the apparition of the old. "Blow up the barricade," said a sergeant, "and yourself with it." Marius retorted, "And myself also!" And he dropped the torch towards the barrel of powder. But there was no longer any one on the barrier. The assailants, abandoning their dead and wounded, flowed back pell-mell and in disorder towards the extremity of the street, and there were again lost in the night. It was a headlong flight. The barricade was free. Chapter 5. End of the verses of Jean Prouvaire. All flocked around Marius. Courfeyrac flung himself on his neck. "Here you are!" "What luck!" said Combeferre. "You came in opportunely," ejaculated Bossuet. "If it had not been for you, I should have been dead," began Courfeyrac again. "If it had not been for you, I should have been gobbled up," added Gavroche. Marius asked, "Where is the chief?" "You are he," said Enjolras. Marius had a furnace in his brain all day long. Now it was a whirlwind. This whirlwind, which was within him, produced on him the effect of being outside of him and of bearing him away. It seemed to him that he was already at an immense distance from life, his 2 luminous months of joy and love ending abruptly at that frightful precipice. Cosette lost to him, that barricade, Monsieur Mabeuf getting himself killed for the Republic, himself the leader of the insurgents. All these things appeared to him like a tremendous nightmare. He was obliged to make a mental effort to recall the fact that all that surrounded him was real. Marius had already seen too much of life not to know that nothing is more imminent than the impossible, and that what is already necessary to foresee is the unforeseen. He had looked on at his own drama as a piece which one does not understand. In the mists which enveloped his thoughts he did not recognize Javert, who, bound to his post, had not so much as moved his head during the whole of the attack on the barricade, and who had gazed on the revolt seething around him with the resignation of a martyr and the majesty of a judge. Marius had not even seen him. In the meanwhile, the assailants did not stir. They could be heard marching and swarming through at the end of the street, but they did not venture into it. either because they were awaiting orders or because they were awaiting reinforcements before hurling themselves afresh on this impregnable redoubt. The insurgents had posted sentinels, and some of them, who were medical students, set about caring for the wounded. They had thrown the tables out of the wine shop, with the exception of the 2 tables reserved for lint and cartridges, and of the one in which lay Father Mabeuf. They had added them to the barricade, and had replaced them in the tap-room with mattresses from the bed of the widow Hushloop and her servants. On these mattresses they had laid the wounded. As for the 3 poor creatures who inhabited Corinth, no one knew what had become of them. They were finally found, however, hidden in the cellar. A poignant emotion clouded the joy of the disencumbered barricade. The roll was called. One of the insurgents was missing. And who was it? One of the dearest, one of the most valiant, Jean Prouvaire. He was sought among the wounded. He was not there. He was sought among the dead. He was not there. He was evidently a prisoner. Combeferre said to Enjolras, "They have our friend. We have their agent. Are you set on the death of that spy?" "Yes," replied Enjolras, "but less so than on the life of Jean Prouvaire. This took place in the tap-room near Javert's post." "Well," resumed Combeferre, "I am going to fasten my handkerchief to this cane and go as a flag of truce, to offer to exchange our man for theirs." "Listen," said Enjolras, laying his hand on Combeferre's arm. At the end of the street there was a significant clash of arms. They heard a manly voice shout, "Vive la France! Long live France! Long live the future!" They recognized the voice of Prouvaire. A flash passed. A report rang out. Silence fell again. "They've killed him!" exclaimed Combeferre. Enjolras glanced at Javert and said to him, "Your friends have just shot you." End of Book 14, Chapters 3, 4, and 5.
Chapters 6 and 7 of Book 14 of Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 14, The Grandeurs of Despair. Chapter 6, The Agony of Death After the Agony of Life. A peculiarity of this species of war is that the attack of the barricades is almost always made from the front, and that the assailants generally abstain from turning the position, either because they fear ambushes, or because they are afraid of getting entangled in the tortuous streets. The assailants' whole attention had been directed, therefore, to the grand barricade, which was evidently the spot always menaced, and there the struggle would infallibly recommence. But Marius thought of the little barricade, and went thither. It was deserted, and guarded only by the fire-pot, which trembled between the paving-stones. Moreover, the Mondétour alley, and the branches of the Rue de la Petite Truanderie and the Rue de Sagna were profoundly calm. As Marius was withdrawing after concluding his inspection, he heard his name pronounced feebly in the darkness. "Monsieur Marius." He started, for he recognized the voice which had called to him 2 hours before through the gate in the Rue Plumet. Only the voice now seemed to be nothing more than a breath. He looked about him, but saw no one. Marius thought he had been mistaken, that it was an illusion added by his mind to the extraordinary realities which were clashing around him. He advanced a step, in order to quit the distant recess where the barricade lay. "Monsieur Marius," repeated the voice. This time he could not doubt that he had heard it distinctly. He looked, and saw nothing. "At your feet," said the voice. He bent down, and saw in the darkness a form which was dragging itself towards him. It was crawling along the pavement. It was this that had spoken to him. The fire-pot allowed him to distinguish a blouse, torn trousers of coarse velvet, bare feet, and something which resembled a pool of blood. Marius indistinctly made out a pale head, which was lifted towards him, and which was saying to him, "You do not recognize me?" "No." "Eponine." Marius bent hastily down. It was, in fact, that unhappy child. She was dressed in men's clothes. "How came you here? What are you doing here?" "I am dying," said she. There are words and incidents which arouse dejected beings. Marius cried out with a start. "You are wounded! Wait, I will carry you into the room. They will attend to you there. Is it serious? How must I hold you in order not to hurt you? Where do you suffer? Help! My God! But why did you come hither?" And he tried to pass his arm under her in order to raise her. She uttered a feeble cry. "Have I hurt you?" asked Marius. "A little. But I only touched your hand." She raised her hand to Marius, and in the middle of that hand Marius saw a black hole. "What is the matter with your hand?" said he. "It is pierced." "Pierced?" "Yes." "What with?" "A bullet." "How?" "Did you see a gun aimed at you?" "Yes, and a hand stopping it." "It was mine." Marius was seized with a shudder. "What madness! Poor child! But so much the better. If that is all, it is nothing. Let me carry you to a bed. They will dress your wound. One does not die of a pierced hand." She murmured, "The bullet traversed my hand, but it came out through my back. It is useless to remove me from the spot. I will tell you how you can care for me better than any surgeon. Sit down near me on the stone." He obeyed. She laid her head on Marius's knees, and without looking at him, she said, "Oh, how good this is! How comfortable this is! There, I no longer suffer." She remained silent for a moment. Then she turned her face with an effort and looked at Marius. "Do you know what, Monsieur Marius? It puzzled me because you entered that garden. It was stupid, because it was I who showed you that house. And then I ought to have said to myself that a young man like you—" She paused, and overstepping the sombre transitions that undoubtedly existed in her mind, she resumed with a heart-rending smile, "You thought me ugly, didn't you?" She continued, "You see, you are lost. Now no one can get out of the barricade. It was I who led you here, by the way. You are going to die, I count upon that. And yet, when I saw them taking aim at you, I put my hand on the muzzle of the gun. How queer it is. But it was because I wanted to die before you. When I received that bullet, I dragged myself here. No one saw me. No one picked me up. I was waiting for you. I said, 'So he is not coming.' Oh, if only you knew. I bit my blouse. I suffered so. Now I am well. Do you remember the day I entered your chamber, and when I looked at myself in your mirror, and the day when I came to you on the boulevard near the washerwomen? How the birds sang. That was a long time ago. You gave me 100 sous, and I said to you, 'I don't want your money.' I hope you picked up your coin. You are not rich. I did not think to tell you to pick it up. The sun was shining bright, and it was not cold. Do you remember, Monsieur Marius? Oh, how happy I am. Everyone is going to die." She had a mad, grave, and heartbreaking air. Her torn blouse disclosed her bare throat. As she talked, she pressed her pierced hand to her breast, where there was another hole, and whence there spurted from moment to moment a stream of blood, like a jet of wine from an open bunghole. Marius gazed at this unfortunate creature with profound compassion. "Oh," she resumed, "it is coming again. I am stifling." She caught up her blouse and bit it, and her limbs stiffened on the pavement. At that moment the young cockscrow executed by little Gavroche resounded through the barricade. The child had mounted a table to load his gun, and was singing gaily the song then so popular. On beholding Lafayette, the gendarme repeats, "Let us flee, let us flee, let us flee." Éponine raised herself and listened. Then she murmured, "It is he." And turning to Marius, "My brother is here. He must not see me. He would scold me." "Your brother?" inquired Marius, who was meditating in the most bitter and sorrowful depths of his heart on the duties to the Thénardiers which his father had bequeathed to him. "Who is your brother?" "That little fellow." "The one who is singing?" "Yes." Marius made a movement. "Oh, don't go away," said she. "It will not be long now." She was sitting almost upright, but her voice was very low and broken by hiccoughs. At intervals the death rattle interrupted her. She put her face as near that of Marius as possible. She added with a strange expression, "Listen, I do not wish to play you a trick. I have a letter in my pocket for you. I was told to put it in the post. I kept it. I did not want to have it reach you, but perhaps you will be angry with me for it when we meet again presently. Take your letter." She grasped Marius's hand convulsively with her pierced hand, but she no longer seemed to feel her sufferings. She put Marius's hand in the pocket of her blouse. There, in fact, Marius felt a paper. "Take it," said she. Marius took the letter. She made a sign of satisfaction and contentment. "Now, for my trouble, promise me." And she stopped. "What?" asked Marius. "Promise me." "I promise." "Promise to give me a kiss on my brow when I am dead. I shall feel it." She dropped her head again on Marius's knees, and her eyelids closed. He thought the poor soul had departed. Éponine remained motionless. All at once, at the very moment when Marius fancied her asleep forever, she slowly opened her eyes, in which appeared the sombre profundity of death, and said to him in a tone whose sweetness seemed already to proceed from another world, "And, by the way, Monsieur Marius, I believe that I was a little bit in love with you." She tried to smile once more, and expired. Chapter 7. Gavroche as a profound calculator of distances. Marius kept his promise. He dropped a kiss on that livid brow, where the icy perspiration stood in beads. This was no infidelity to Cosette. It was a gentle and pensive farewell to an unhappy soul. It was not without a tremor that he had taken the letter which Éponine had given him. He had immediately felt that it was an event of weight. He was impatient to read it. The heart of man is so constituted that the unhappy child had hardly closed her eyes when Marius began to think of unfolding this paper. He laid her gently on the ground, and went away. Something told him that he could not peruse that letter in the presence of that body. He drew near to a candle in the tap-room. It was a small note, folded and sealed with a woman's elegant care. The address was in a woman's hand, and ran, "To Monsieur Marius Pontmercy, at Monsieur Courfeyrac's, Rue de la Verrerie, No. 16. He broke the seal and read, "My dearest, alas! My father insists on our setting out immediately. We shall be this evening in the Rue de l'Homme-Armé, No. 7. In a week we shall be in England. Cosette, June 4th. Such was the innocence of their love, that Marius was not even acquainted with Cosette's handwriting. What had taken place may be related in a few words. Éponine had been the cause of everything. After the evening of the 3rd of June, she had cherished a double idea: to defeat the projects of her father and the ruffians on the house of the Rue Plumet, and to separate Marius and Cosette. She had exchanged rags with the first young scamp she came across who had thought it amusing to dress like a woman, while Éponine disguised herself like a man. It was she who had conveyed to Jean Valjean in the Champ de Mars the expressive warning, "Leave your house." Jean Valjean had, in fact, returned home, and had said to Cosette, "We set out this evening, and we go to the Rue de l'Homme-Armé with Toussaint. Next week we shall be in London." Cosette, utterly overwhelmed by this unexpected blow, had hastily penned a couple of lines to Marius. But how was she to get the letter to the post? She never went out alone, and Toussaint, surprised at such a commission, would certainly show the letter to Monsieur Fauchelevent. In this dilemma, Cosette had caught sight through the fence of Éponine in men's clothes, who now prowled incessantly around the garden. Cosette had called to this young workman, and had handed him 5 francs and the letter, saying, "Carry this letter immediately to its address." Éponine had put the letter in her pocket. The next day, on the 5th of June, she went to Courfeyrac's quarters to inquire for Marius, not for the purpose of delivering the letter, but, a thing which every jealous and loving soul will comprehend, to see. There she had waited for Marius, or at least for Courfeyrac, still for the purpose of seeing. When Courfeyrac had told her, "We are going to the Barricades," an idea flashed through her mind: to fling herself into that death, as she would have done into any other, and to thrust Marius into it also. She had followed Courfeyrac, had made sure of the locality where the barricade was in the process of construction, and quite certain, since Marius had received no warning, and since she had intercepted the letter, that he would go at dusk to his trysting place for every evening, she had betaken herself to the Rue Plumet, had there awaited Marius, and had sent him, in the name of his friends, the appeal which would, she thought, lead him to the barricade. She reckoned on Marius's despair when he should fail to find Cosette. She was not mistaken. She had returned to the Rue de la Chanvrerie herself. What she did there, the reader has just seen. She died with the tragic joy of jealous hearts, who drag the beloved being into their own death, and who say, "No one shall have him." Marius covered Cosette's letter with kisses. So she loved him. For one moment the idea occurred to him that he ought not to die now. Then he said to himself, "She is going away. Her father is taking her to England, and my grandfather refuses his consent to the marriage. Nothing is changed in our fates." Dreamers like Marius are subject to supreme attacks of dejection, and desperate resolves are the result. The fatigue of living is insupportable. Death is sooner over with. Then he reflected that he had still 2 duties to fulfill: to inform Cosette of his death and send her a final farewell, and to save from the impending catastrophe which was in preparation that poor child, Éponine's brother and Thénardier's son. He had a pocket-book about him, the same one which had contained the notebook in which he had inscribed so many thoughts of love for Cosette. He tore out a leaf, and wrote on it a few lines in pencil. "Our marriage was impossible. I asked my grandfather, he refused. I have no fortune, neither hast thou. I hastened to thee, thou wert no longer there. Thou knowest the promise that I gave thee, I shall keep it. I die. I love thee. When thou readest this, my soul will be near thee, and thou wilt smile." Having nothing wherewith to seal this letter, he contented himself with folding the paper in 4, and added the address: "To Mademoiselle Cosette Fauchelevent, and Monsieur Fauchelevent's, Rue de l'Homarmé, number 7. Having folded the letter, he stood in thought for a moment, drew out his pocket-book again, opened it, and wrote with the same pencil these 4 lines on the first page. My name is Marius Pontmercy. Carry my body to my grandfather, Monsieur Gillenormand, Rue des Filles du Calvaire, number 6, in the Marais. He put his pocket-book back in his pocket. Then he called Gavroche. The gamin, at the sound of Marius's voice, ran up to him with his merry and devoted air. "Will you do something for me?" "Anything," said Gavroche. "Good God! If it had not been for you, I should have been done for." "Do you see this letter?" "Yes." "Take it. Leave the barricade instantly." Gavroche began to scratch his ear uneasily. "And tomorrow morning you will deliver it at its address to Mademoiselle Cosette at Monsieur Fauchelevent's, Rue de l'Homarmé, number 7. The heroic child replied, "Well, but in the meanwhile the barricade will be taken, and I shall not be there." "The barricade will not be attacked until daybreak, according to all appearances, and will not be taken before tomorrow noon." The fresh respite which the assailants were granting to the barricade had in fact been prolonged. It was one of those intermissions which frequently occur in nocturnal combats, which are always followed by an increase of rage. "Well," said Gavroche, "what if I were to go and carry your letter tomorrow?" "It will be too late. The barricade will probably be blockaded, all the streets will be guarded, and you will not be able to get out. Go at once." Gavroche could think of no reply to this, and stood there in indecision, scratching his ear sadly. All at once he took the letter, with one of those bird-like movements which were so common with him. "All right," said he. And he started off at a run through Mondétour Lane. An idea had occurred to Gavroche, which had brought him to a decision, but he had not mentioned it, for fear that Marius might offer some objection to it. This was the idea. "It is barely midnight. The Rue de l'Homarmé is not far off. I will go and deliver the letter at once, and I shall get back in time." End of Book 14, Chapter 7. Chapter 1 of Book 15 of Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 15, The Rue de l'Homarmé. Chapter 1. A Drinker is a Babbler. What are the convulsions of a city in comparison with the insurrections of the soul? Man is a depth still greater than the people. Jean Valjean, at that very moment, was the prey of a terrible upheaval. Every sort of gulf had opened again within him. He also was trembling, like Paris, on the brink of an obscure and formidable revolution. A few hours had sufficed to bring this about. His destiny and his conscience had suddenly been covered with gloom. Of him also, as well as of Paris, it might have been said, "Two principles are face to face. The white angel and the black angel are about to seize each other on the bridge of the abyss. Which of the two will hurl the other over? Who will carry the day?" On the evening preceding this same 5th of June, Jean Valjean, accompanied by Cosette and Toussaint, had installed himself in the Rue de l'Homarmé. A change awaited him there. Cosette had not quitted the Rue Plumet without making an effort at resistance. For the first time since they had lived side by side, Cosette's will and the will of Jean Valjean had proved to be distinct, and had been in opposition at least, if they had not clashed. There had been objections on one side, and inflexibility on the other. The abrupt advice, "Leave your house," hurled at Jean Valjean by a stranger, had alarmed him to the extent of rendering him peremptory. He thought that he had been traced and followed. Cosette had been obliged to give way. Both had arrived in the Rue de l'Homarmé without opening their lips, and without uttering a word, each being absorbed in his own personal preoccupation. Jean Valjean so uneasy that he did not notice Cosette's sadness. Cosette so sad that she did not notice Jean Valjean's uneasiness. Jean Valjean had taken Toussaint with him, a thing which he had never done in his previous absences. He perceived the possibility of not returning to the Rue Plumet, and he could neither leave Toussaint behind nor confide his secret to her. Besides, he felt that she was devoted and trustworthy. Treachery between master and servant begins in curiosity. Now Toussaint, as though she had been destined to be Jean Valjean's servant, was not curious. She stammered in her peasant dialect of Barneville, "I am made so. I do my work. The rest is no affair of mine." In this departure from the Rue Plumet, which had been almost a flight, Jean Valjean had carried away nothing but the little embalmed valise, baptized by Cosette, the Inseparable. Full trunks would have required porters, and porters are witnesses. A fiacre had been summoned to the door on the Rue de Babylone, and they had taken their departure. It was with difficulty that Toussaint had obtained permission to pack up a little linen and clothes and a few toilet articles. Cosette had taken only her portfolio and her blotting-book. Jean Valjean, with a view to augmenting the solitude and the mystery of this departure, had arranged to quit the pavilion of the Rue Plumet only at dusk, which had allowed Cosette time to write her note to Marius. They had arrived in the Rue de l'Homme-Armé after night had fully fallen. They had gone to bed in silence. The lodgings in the Rue de l'Homme-Armé were situated on a back court, on the second floor, and were composed of 2 sleeping rooms, a dining room, and a kitchen adjoining the dining room, with a garret where there was a folding bed, and which fell to Toussaint's share. The dining room was an antechamber as well, and separated the 2 bedrooms. The apartment was provided with all necessary utensils. People reacquire confidence as foolishly as they lose it. Human nature is so constituted. Hardly had Jean Valjean reached the Rue de l'Homme-Armé when his anxiety was lightened, and by degrees dissipated. There are soothing spots which act in some sort mechanically on the mind. An obscure street, peaceable inhabitants. Jean Valjean experienced an indescribable contagion of tranquillity in that alley of ancient Paris, which is so narrow that it is barred against carriages by a transverse beam placed on 2 posts, which is deaf and dumb in the midst of the clamorous city, dimly lighted at midday, and is, so to speak, incapable of emotions between 2 rows of lofty houses centuries old, which hold their peace like ancients as they are. There was a touch of stagnant oblivion in that street. Jean Valjean drew his breath once more there. How could he be found there? His first care was to place the Inseparable beside him. He slept well. Night brings wisdom. We may add, night soothes. On the following morning, he awoke in a mood that was almost gay. He thought the dining-room charming, though it was hideous, furnished with an old round table, a long sideboard surmounted by a slanting mirror, a dilapidated armchair, and several plain chairs which were encumbered with Toussaint's packages. In one of these packages, Jean Valjean's uniform of a National Guard was visible through a rent. As for Cosette, she had had Toussaint take some broth to her room, and did not make her appearance until evening. About 5 o'clock, Toussaint, who was going and coming and busying herself with the tiny establishment, set on the table a cold chicken, which Cosette, out of deference to her father, consented to glance at. That done, Cosette, under the pretext of an obstinate sick headache, had bade Jean Valjean good night, and had shut herself up in her chamber. Jean Valjean had eaten a wing of the chicken with a good appetite, and with his elbows on the table, having gradually recovered his serenity, had regained possession of his sense of security. While he was discussing this modest dinner, he had twice or thrice noticed in a confused way Toussaint's stammering words as she said to him, "Monsieur, there is something going on. They are fighting in Paris." But absorbed in a throng of inward calculations, He had paid no heed to it. To tell the truth, he had not heard her. He rose and began to pace from the door to the window and from the window to the door, growing ever more serene. With this calm, Cosette, his sole anxiety, recurred to his thoughts. Not that he was troubled by this headache, a little nervous crisis, a young girl's fit of sulks, the cloud of a moment. There would be nothing left of it in a day or two. But he meditated on the future, and, as was his habit, he thought of it with pleasure. After all, he saw no obstacle to their happy life resuming its course. At certain hours, everything seems impossible. At others, everything appears easy. Jean Valjean was in the midst of one of these good hours. They generally succeed the bad ones, as day follows night, by virtue of that law of succession and of contrast which lies at the very foundation of nature, and which superficial minds call antithesis. In this peaceful street where he had taken refuge, Jean Valjean got rid of all that had been troubling him for some time past. This very fact, that he had seen many shadows, made him begin to perceive a little azure. To have quitted the Rue Plumet without complications or incidents was one good step already accomplished. Perhaps it would be wise to go abroad, if only for a few months, and to set out for London. Well, they would go. What difference did it make to him whether he was in France or in England, provided he had Cosette beside him? Cosette was his nation. Cosette sufficed for his happiness. The idea that he, perhaps, did not suffice for Cosette's happiness, that idea which had formerly been the cause of his fever and sleeplessness, did not even present itself to his mind. He was in a state of collapse from all his past sufferings, and he was fully entered on optimism. Cosette was by his side, she seemed to be his. An optical illusion which everyone has experienced. He arranged in his own mind, with all sorts of felicitous devices, his departure for England with Cosette, and he beheld his felicity reconstituted wherever he pleased, in the perspective of his reverie. As he paced to and fro with long strides, his glance suddenly encountered something strange. In the inclined mirror facing him which surmounted the sideboard, he saw the 4 lines which follow. "My dearest, alas! My father insists on our setting out immediately. We shall be this evening in the Rue de l'Homme-Armé, No. 7. In a week we shall be in England. Cosette, June 4th. Jean Valjean halted, perfectly haggard. Cosette, on her arrival, had placed her blotting-book on the sideboard in front of the mirror, and, utterly absorbed in her agony of grief, had forgotten it and left it there, without even observing that she had left it wide open, and open at precisely the page on which she had laid to dry the 4 lines which she had penned, and which she had given in charge of the young workman in the Rue Plumet. The writing had been printed off on the blotter. The mirror reflected the writing. The result was, what is called in geometry, the symmetrical image, so that the writing, reversed on the blotter, was righted in the mirror, and presented its natural appearance. And Jean Valjean had beneath his eyes the letter written by Cosette to Marius on the preceding evening. It was simple and withering. Jean Valjean stepped up to the mirror. He read the 4 lines again, but he did not believe them. They produced on him the effect of appearing in a flash of lightning. It was a hallucination. It was impossible. It was not so. Little by little, his perceptions became more precise. He looked at Cosette's blotting-book, and the consciousness of the reality returned to him. He caught up the blotter and said, "It comes from there." He feverishly examined the 4 lines imprinted on the blotter, the reversal of the letters converted into an odd scrawl, and he saw no sense in it. Then he said to himself, "But this signifies nothing. There is nothing written here." And he drew a long breath with inexpressible relief. Who has not experienced those foolish joys in horrible instants? The soul does not surrender to despair until it has exhausted all illusions. He held the blotter in his hand, and contemplated it in stupid delight, almost ready to laugh at the hallucination of which he had been the dupe. All at once his eyes fell upon the mirror again, and again he beheld the vision. There were the 4 lines, outlined with inexorable clearness. This time it was no mirage. The recurrence of a vision is a reality. It was palpable. It was the writing restored in the mirror. He understood. Jean Valjean tottered, dropped the blotter, and fell into the old armchair beside the buffet, with drooping head and glassy eyes, in utter bewilderment. He told himself that it was plain, that the light of the world had been eclipsed forever, and that Cosette had written that to someone. Then he heard his soul, which had become terrible once more, give vent to a dull roar in the gloom. Try then the effect of taking from the lion the dog which he has in his cage. Strange and sad to say, at that very moment, Marius had not yet received Cosette's letter. Chance had treacherously carried it to Jean Valjean before delivering it to Marius. Up to that day, Jean Valjean had not been vanquished by trial. He had been subjected to fearful proofs. No violence of bad fortune had been spared him. The ferocity of fate, armed with all vindictiveness and all social scorn, had taken him for her prey and had raged against him. He had accepted every extremity when it had been necessary. He had sacrificed his inviolability as a reformed man, had yielded up his liberty, risked his head, lost everything, suffered everything, and he had remained disinterested and stoical, to such a point that he might have been thought to be absent from himself like a martyr. His conscience, inured to every assault of destiny, might have appeared to be forever impregnable. Well, anyone who had beheld his spiritual self would have been obliged to concede that it weakened at that moment. It was because, of all the tortures which he had undergone in the course of this long inquisition to which destiny had doomed him, this was the most terrible. Never had such pincers seized him hitherto. He felt the mysterious stirring of all his latent sensibilities. He felt the plucking at the strange cord. Alas, the supreme trial, let us say rather the only trial, is the loss of the beloved being. Poor old Jean Valjean certainly did not love Cosette otherwise than as a father. But we have already remarked above that into this paternity the widowhood of his life had introduced all the shades of love. He loved Cosette as his daughter, and he loved her as his mother, and he loved her as his sister, and as he had never had either a woman to love or a wife, as nature is a creditor who accepts no protest, that sentiment also, the most impossible to lose, was mingled with the rest, vague, ignorant, pure with the purity of blindness, unconscious, celestial, angelic, divine, less like a sentiment than like an instinct, less like an instinct than like an imperceptible and invisible but real attraction. And love, properly speaking, was in his immense tenderness for Cosette like the thread of gold in the mountain, concealed and virgin. Let the reader recall the situation of heart which we have already indicated. No marriage was possible between them, not even that of souls. And yet it is certain that their destinies were wedded. With the exception of Cosette, that is to say, with the exception of a childhood, Jean Valjean had never, in the whole of his long life, known anything of that which may be loved. The passions and loves which succeed each other had not produced in him those successive green growths, tender green or dark green, which can be seen in foliage which passes through the winter, and in men who pass 50. In short, and we have insisted on it more than once, all this interior fusion, all this whole, of which the sum total was a lofty virtue, ended in rendering Jean Valjean a father to Cosette. a strange father, forged from the grandfather, the son, the brother, and the husband that existed in Jean Valjean. A father in whom there was included even a mother. A father who loved Cosette and adored her, and who held that child as his light, his home, his family, his country, his paradise. Thus, when he saw that the end had absolutely come, that she was escaping from him, that she was slipping from his hands, that she was gliding from him like a cloud, like water, when he had before his eyes this crushing proof, another is the goal of her heart, another is the wish of her life. There is a dearest one. I am no longer anything but her father. I no longer exist. When he could no longer doubt, when he said to himself, "She is going away from me," the grief which he felt surpassed the bounds of possibility. To have done all that he had done for the purpose of ending like this! And the very idea of being nothing. Then, as we have just said, a quiver of revolt ran through him from head to foot. He felt, even in the very roots of his hair, the immense reawakening of egotism, and the I in this man's abyss howled. There is such a thing as the sudden giving way of the inward subsoil. A despairing certainty does not make its way into a man without first thrusting aside and breaking certain profound elements, which, in some cases, are the very man himself. Grief, when it attains this shape, is a headlong flight of all the forces of the conscience. These are fatal crises. Few among us emerge from them still like ourselves and firm in duty. When the limit of endurance is overstepped, the most imperturbable virtue is disconcerted. Jean Valjean took the blotter again, and convinced himself afresh. He remained bowed, and as though petrified, and with staring eyes, over those 4 unobjectionable lines. And there arose within him such a cloud that one might have thought that everything in this soul was crumbling away. He examined this revelation, athwart the exaggerations of reverie, with an apparent and terrifying calmness, for it is a fearful thing when a man's calmness reaches the coldness of the statue. He measured the terrible step which his destiny had taken without his having a suspicion of the fact. He recalled his fears of the preceding summer, so foolishly dissipated. He recognized the precipice. It was still the same. Only Jean Valjean was no longer on the brink. He was at the bottom of it. The unprecedented and heart-rending thing about it was that he had fallen without perceiving it. All the light of his life had departed, while he still fancied that he beheld the sun. His instinct did not hesitate. He put together certain circumstances, certain dates, certain blushes and certain pallors on Cosette's part, and he said to himself, "It is he." The divination of despair is a sort of mysterious bow which never misses its aim. He struck Marius with his first conjecture. He did not know the name, but he found the man instantly. He distinctly perceived, in the background of the implacable conjuration of his memories, the unknown prowler of the Luxembourg, that wretched seeker of love adventures, that idler of romance, that idiot, that coward, for it is cowardly to come and make eyes at young girls who have beside them a father who loves them. After he had thoroughly verified the fact that this man was at the bottom of this situation, and that everything proceeded from that quarter, he, Jean Valjean, the regenerated man, the man who had so labored over his soul, the man who had made so many efforts to resolve all life, all misery, and all unhappiness into love, looked into his own breast, and there beheld a spectre. Hate. Great griefs contain something of dejection. They discourage one with existence. The man into whom they enter feels something within him withdraw from him. In his youth their visits are lugubrious. Later on they are sinister. Alas, if despair is a fearful thing when the blood is hot, when the hair is black, when the head is erect on the body like the flame on the torch, when the roll of destiny still retains its full thickness, when the heart, full of desirable love, still possesses beats which can be returned to it, when one has time for redress, when all women and all smiles, and all the future and all the horizon are before one, when the force of life is complete? What is it in old age, when the years hasten on, growing ever paler, to that twilight hour when one begins to behold the stars of the tomb? While he was meditating, Toussaint entered. Jean Valjean rose and asked her, "In what quarter is it? Do you know?" Toussaint was struck dumb, and could only answer him, "What is it, sir?" Jean Valjean began again. "Did you not tell me that just now, that there is fighting going on?" "Ah, yes, sir," replied Toussaint. "It is in the direction of Saint-Merry." There is a mechanical movement which comes to us, unconsciously, from the most profound depths of our thought. It was, no doubt, under the impulse of a movement of this sort, and of which he was hardly conscious, that Jean Valjean, 5 minutes later, found himself in the street. Bareheaded, he sat upon the stone post at the door of his house. He seemed to be listening. Night had come. End of Book 15, Chapter 1. Chapters 2 and 3 of Book 15 of Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 15, The Rue de l'Homme, Chapter 2, The Street Urchin, an Enemy of Light. How long did he remain thus? What was the ebb and flow of this tragic meditation? Did he straighten up? Did he remain bowed? Had he been bent to breaking? Could he still rise and regain his footing in his conscience upon something solid? He probably would not have been able to tell himself. The street was deserted. A few uneasy bourgeois, who were rapidly returning home, hardly saw him. Each one for himself in times of peril. The lamplighter came as usual to light the lantern, which was situated precisely opposite the door of number 7, and then went away. Jean Valjean would not have appeared like a living man to anyone who had examined him in that shadow. He sat there on the post of his door, motionless as a form of ice. There was congealment in despair. The alarm bells and a vague and stormy uproar were audible. In the midst of all these convulsions of the bell mingled with the revolt, the clock of St. Paul struck 11, gravely and without haste. For the tocsin is man, the hour is God. The passage of the hour produced no effect on Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean did not stir. Still, at about that moment, a brusque report burst forth in the direction of the Halles. A second, yet more violent, followed. It was probably that attack on the barricade in the Rue de la Chanvrerie which we have just seen repulsed by Marius. At this double discharge, whose fury seemed augmented by the stupor of the night, Jean Valjean started. He rose, turning towards the quarter whence the noise proceeded. Then he fell back upon the post again, folded his arms, and his head slowly sank on his bosom again. He resumed his gloomy dialogue with himself. All at once he raised his eyes. Someone was walking in the street. He heard steps near him. He looked, and by the light of the lanterns, in the direction of the street which ran into the Rue aux Archives, he perceived a young, livid, and beaming face. Gavroche had just arrived in the Rue l'Homme. Gavroche was staring into the air, apparently in search of something. He saw Jean Valjean perfectly well, but he took no notice of him. Gavroche, after staring into the air, stared below. He raised himself on tiptoe, and felt of the doors and windows of the ground floor. They were all shut, bolted, and padlocked. After having authenticated the fronts of 5 or 6 barricaded houses in this manner, the urchin shrugged his shoulders, and took himself to task in these terms. "Party!" Then he began to stare into the air again. Jean Valjean, who an instant previously, in his then state of mind, would not have spoken to or even answered anyone, felt irresistibly impelled to accost that child. "What is the matter with you, my little fellow?" he said. "The matter with me is that I am hungry," replied Gavroche frankly. And he added, "Little fellow yourself." Jean Valjean fumbled in his fob, and pulled out a 5-franc piece. But Gavroche, who was of the wagtail species, and who skipped vivaciously from one gesture to another, had just picked up a stone. He had caught sight of the lantern. "See here," said he, "you still have your lanterns here. You are disobeying the regulations, my friend. This is disorderly. Smash that for me." And he flung the stone at the lantern, whose broken glass fell with such a clatter that the bourgeois in hiding behind their curtains in the opposite house cried, "There is 93, come again!" The lantern oscillated violently and went out. The street had suddenly become black. "That's right, old street," ejaculated Gavroche. "Put on your nightcap." And turning to Jean Valjean, "What do you call that gigantic monument that you have there at the end of the street? It's the Archive, isn't it? I must crumble up those big stupids of pillars a bit, and make a nice barricade out of them." Jean Valjean stepped up to Gavroche. "Poor creature," he said in a low tone, and speaking to himself. "He is hungry." And he laid the 100-sou piece in his hand. Gavroche raised his face, astonished at the size of this sou. He stared at it in the darkness, and the whiteness of the big sou dazzled him. He knew 5-franc pieces by hearsay. Their reputation was agreeable to him. He was delighted to see one close to. He said, "Let us contemplate the tiger." He gazed at it for several minutes in ecstasy. Then, turning to Jean Valjean, he held out the coin to him, and said majestically to him, "Bourgeois, I prefer to smash lanterns. Take back your ferocious beast. You can't bribe me. That has got 5 claws, but it doesn't scratch me." "Have you a mother?" asked Jean Valjean. Gavroche replied, "More than you have, perhaps." "Well," returned Jean Valjean, "keep the money for your mother." Gavroche was touched. Moreover, he had just noticed that the man who was addressing him had no hat, and this inspired him with confidence. "Truly," said he, "so it wasn't to keep me from breaking the lanterns?" "Break whatever you please." "You're a fine man," said Gavroche. And he put the 5-franc piece into one of his pockets. His confidence having increased, he added, "Do you belong in this street?" "Yes, why?" "Can you tell me where number 7 is?" "What do you want with number 7? Here the child paused. He feared that he had said too much. He thrust his nails energetically into his hair, and contented himself with replying, "Ah, here it is." An idea flashed through Jean Valjean's mind. Anguish does have these gleams. He said to the lad, "Are you the person who is bringing a letter that I am expecting?" "You?" said Gavroche. "You are not a woman." "The letter is for Mademoiselle Cosette, is it not?" "Cosette," muttered Gavroche. "Yes, I believe that is the queer name." "Well," resumed Jean Valjean, "I am the person to whom you are to deliver the letter. Give it here." "In that case, you must know that I was sent from the barricade." "Of course," said Jean Valjean. Gavroche engulfed his hand in another of his pockets, and drew out a paper folded in 4. Then he made the military salute. "Respect for dispatches," said he. "It comes from the provisional government." "Give it to me," said Jean Valjean. Gavroche held the paper elevated above his head. "Don't go and fancy it's a love letter. It is for a woman, but it's for the people. We men fight, and we respect the fair sex. We are not as they are in fine society, where there are lions who send chickens to camels. Give it to me." "After all," continued Gavroche, "you have the air of an honest man. Give it to me quick. Catch hold of it." And he handed the paper to Jean Valjean. "And make haste, Monsieur What's-your-name, for Mademoiselle Cosette is waiting." Gavroche was satisfied with himself for having produced this remark. Jean Valjean began again. "Is it to Saint-Merry that the answer is to be sent?" "There you are making some of those bits of pastry vulgarly called brioches. This letter comes from the barricade of the Rue de la Chanvrerie, and I'm going back there. Good evening, citizen." That said, Gavroche took himself off, or to describe it more exactly, fluttered away in the direction whence he had come, with a flight like that of an escaped bird. He plunged back into the gloom as though he made a hole in it, with the rigid rapidity of a projectile. The alley of l'Homme Armé became silent and solitary once more. In a twinkling, that strange child, who had about him something of the shadow and of the dream, had buried himself in the mists of the rows of black houses, and was lost there, like smoke in the dark. And one might have thought that he had dissipated and vanished, had there not taken place, a few minutes after his disappearance, a startling shiver of glass, and had not the magnificent crash of a lantern rattling down on the pavement once more abruptly awakened the indignant bourgeois. It was Gavroche, upon his way through the Rue de Chaume. Chapter 3. While Cosette and Toussaint are asleep. Jean Valjean went into the house with Marius' letter. He groped his way up the stairs, as pleased with the dark as an owl who grips his prey, opened and shut his door softly, listened to see whether he could hear any noise, made sure that, to all appearances, Cosette and Toussaint were asleep, and plunged 3 or 4 matches into the bottle of the fumade lighter before he could evoke a spark, so greatly did his hand tremble. What he had just done smacked of theft. At last the candle was lighted. He leaned his elbows on the table, unfolded the paper, and read. In violent emotions, one does not read. One flings to the earth, so to speak, the paper which one holds. One clutches it like a victim. One crushes it. One digs into it the nails of one's wrath or of one's joy. One hastens to the end. One leaps to the beginning. Attention is at fever heat. It takes up in the gross, as it were, the essential points. It seizes on one point, and the rest disappears. In Marius' note to Cosette, Jean Valjean saw only these words: I die. When thou readest this, my soul will be near thee. In the presence of these 2 lines, he was horribly dazzled. He remained for a moment, crushed, as it were, by the change of emotions which was taking place within him. He stared at Marius' note with a sort of intoxicated amazement. He had before his eyes that splendor, the death of a hated individual. He uttered a frightful cry of inward joy. So it was all over. The catastrophe had arrived sooner than he had dared to hope. The being who obstructed his destiny was disappearing. That man had taken himself off of his own accord, freely, willingly. This man was going to his death, and he, Jean Valjean, had had no hand in the matter, and it was through no fault of his. Perhaps, even, he is already dead. Here his fever entered into calculations. No, he is not dead yet. The letter had evidently been intended for Cosette to read on the following morning. After the 2 discharges that were heard between 11 o'clock and midnight, nothing more has taken place. The barricade will not be attacked seriously until daybreak. But that makes no difference, From the moment when that man is concerned in this war, he is lost. He is caught in the gearing. Jean Valjean felt himself delivered. So he was about to find himself alone with Cosette once more. The rivalry would cease. The future was beginning again. He had but to keep this note in his pocket. Cosette would never know what had become of that man. All that there requires to be done is to let things take their own course. This man cannot escape. If he is not already dead, it is certain that he is about to die. What good fortune! Having said all this to himself, he became gloomy. Then he went downstairs and woke up the porter. About an hour later, Jean Valjean went out in the complete costume of a National Guard and with his arms. The porter had easily found in the neighborhood the wherewithal to complete his equipment. He had a loaded gun and a cartridge box filled with cartridges. He strode off in the direction of the markets. End of Chapter 3.
Chapter 4 of Book 15 of Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 15, The Rue de l'Homme Armé. Chapter 4, Gavroche's Excess of Zeal. In the meantime, Gavroche had had an adventure. Gavroche, after having conscientiously stoned the lantern in the Rue de Chaume, entered the Rue de Vieilles Haudriettes, and not seeing even a cat there, he thought the opportunity a good one to strike up all the song of which he was capable. His march, far from being retarded by his singing, was accelerated by it. He began to sow along the sleeping or terrified houses these incendiary couplets. L'oiseau me dit dans la chemise et prétend qui attela avec une rousse et là où vont les belles filles là. Mon ami Pierrot tout babillé parce que l'autre jour mille là. Cogne sa vitre et met pas là où vont les belles filles là. Les drôles sont fort gentils, les poisons qui me sont là. Griselet, monsieur, au fila, où vont les belles filles là. J'aime l'amour et les bisbilles, j'aime Agnès, j'aime Pamela. Lisons l'amant, c'est brûlant, où vont les belles filles là. Jadis quand j'ai vu le menti des osettes et des élas, mon âme le plus aimée-là, où vont les belles filles là. Amour, quand dans l'ombre où tu brilles, tu coiffes tes roses là. Je me donnerai pour cela, où vont les belles filles là. Viens à ton miroir tout habillé, mon cœur un beau jour s'envola, et crois que c'est là, où vont les belles filles là. Le soir en sortant des quadrilles, je montrai aux étoiles celle-là, et je le dis, regardez-la, où vont les belles filles là. Gavroche, as he sang, was lavish of his pantomime. Gesture is the strong point of the refrain. His face, an inexhaustible repertory of masks, produced grimaces more convulsing and more fantastic than the rents of a cloth torn in a high gale. Unfortunately, as he was alone, and as it was night, this was neither seen nor even visible. Such wastes of riches do occur. All at once he stopped short. "Let us interrupt the romance," said he. His feline eye had just descried, in the recess of a carriage door, what is called in painting an ensemble, that is to say, a person and a thing. The thing was a handcart, the person was a man from Auvergne who was sleeping therein. The shafts of the cart rested on the pavement, and the Auvergnat's head was supported against the front of the cart. His body was coiled up on this inclined plane, and his feet touched the ground. Gavroche, with his experience of the things of this world, recognized a drunken man. He was some corner errand man who had drunk too much, and was sleeping too much. There now, thought Gavroche, that's what the summer nights are good for. We'll take the cart for the Republic, and leave the Auvergnat for the monarchy. His mind had just been illuminated by this flash of light. How bully that cart would look on our barricade. The Auvergnat was snoring. Gavroche gently tugged at the cart from behind, and at the Auvergnat from the front, that is to say, by the feet, and at the expiration of another minute the imperturbable Auvergnat was reposing flat on the pavement. The cart was free. Gavroche, habituated to facing the unexpected in all quarters, had everything about him. He fumbled in one of his pockets, and pulled from it a scrap of paper and a bit of red pencil filched from some carpenter. He wrote, "French Republic. Received thy cart." And he signed it, Gavroche. That done, he put the paper in the pocket of the still snoring Auvergnat's velvet vest, seized the cart shafts in both hands, and set off in the direction of the Halles, pushing the cart before him at a hard gallop with a glorious and triumphant uproar. This was perilous. There was a post at the royal printing establishment. Gavroche did not think of this. This post was occupied by the National Guards of the suburbs. The squad began to wake up, and heads were raised from camp beds. 2 street lanterns broken in succession, that ditty sung at the top of the lungs. This was a great deal for those cowardly streets, which desire to go to sleep at sunset, and which put the extinguisher on their candles at such an early hour. For the last hour that boy had been creating an uproar in that peaceable arrondissement, the uproar of a fly in a bottle. The sergeant of the banlieue lent an ear. He waited. He was a prudent man. The mad rattle of the cart filled to overflowing the possible measure of waiting, and decided the sergeant to make a reconnaissance. "There's a whole band of them there," said he. "Let us proceed gently." It was clear that the hydra of anarchy had emerged from its box, and that it was stalking abroad through the quarter. And the sergeant ventured out of the post with cautious tread. All at once, Gavroche, pushing his cart in front of him, and at the very moment when he was about to turn into the Rue des Vieilles Haudriettes, found himself face to face with a uniform, a shako, a plume, and a gun. For the second time he stopped short. "Hullo," said he, "it's him. Good day, public order." Gavroche's amazement was always brief and speedily thawed. "Where are you going, you rascal?" shouted the sergeant. "Citizen," retorted Gavroche, "I haven't called you bourgeois yet. Why do you insult me?" "Where are you going, you rogue?" "Monsieur," retorted Gavroche, "perhaps you were a man of wit yesterday, but you have degenerated this morning." "I ask you, where are you going, you villain?" Gavroche replied, "You speak prettily. No, really, no one would suppose you as old as you are. You ought to sell all your hair at 100 francs apiece. That would yield you 500 francs. "Where are you going? Where are you going? Where are you going, bandit?" Gavroche retorted again, "What villainous words! You must wipe your mouth better the first time that they give you suck." The sergeant lowered his bayonet. "Will you tell me where you are going, you wretch?" "General," said Gavroche, "I'm on my way to look for a doctor for my wife, who is in labour." "To arms!" shouted the sergeant. The master stroke of strong men consists in saving themselves by the very means that have ruined them. Gavroche took in the whole situation at a glance. It was the cart which had told against him. It was the cart's place to protect him. At the moment when the sergeant was on the point of making his descent on Gavroche, the cart, converted into a projectile and launched with all the latter's might, rolled down upon him furiously, and the sergeant, struck full in the stomach, tumbled over backwards into the gutter while his gun went off in the air. The men of the post had rushed out pell-mell at the sergeant's shout. The shot brought on a general random discharge, after which they reloaded their weapons and began again. This blind man's buff musketry lasted for a quarter of an hour, and killed several panes of glass. In the meanwhile, Gavroche, who had retraced his steps at full speed, halted 5 or 6 streets distant and seated himself, panting, on the stone post which forms the corner of the Enfant Rouge. He listened. After panting for a few minutes, he turned in the direction where the fusillade was raging, lifted his left hand to a level with his nose, and thrust it forward 3 times, as he slapped the back of his head with his right hand, an imperious gesture in which Parisian street urchindom has condensed French irony, and which is evidently efficacious, since it has already lasted half a century. This gaiety was troubled by one bitter reflection. "Yes," said he, "I'm splitting with laughter, I'm twisting with delight, I abound in joy, but I'm losing my way. I shall have to take a roundabout way. If I only reach the barricade in season." Thereupon he set out again on a run, and as he ran, "Ah, by the way, where was I?" said he, and he resumed his ditty as he plunged rapidly through the streets, and this is what died away in the gloom. Mais il reste encore des pastilles, et je vais mettre les holà dans l'ordre public, et voilà où vont les belles filons là. Quelqu'un veut-il jouer au cuit, tout l'ancien monde s'écroula, quand la grosse brûla. Où vont les belles filons là? Vieux bon peuple, coup des péquilles, que sont ces Louvres, vous étiez là? La monarchie, on falbala, où vont les belles filons là? Nous en avance, force la grille, les Rachel dit ces jours-là. Tenez mal et c'est décolla, où vont les belles filons là? The post's recourse to arms was not without result. The cart was conquered, the drunken man was taken prisoner. The first was put in the pound, the second was later on somewhat harassed before the councils of war as an accomplice. The public ministry of the day proved its indefatigable zeal in the defence of society in this instance. Gavroche's adventure, which has lingered as a tradition in the quarters of the Temple, is one of the most terrible souvenirs of that elderly bourgeois of the Marais, and is entitled in their memories, "The Nocturnal Attack by the Post of the Royal Printing Establishment." End of Book 15, Chapter 4.